Welcome to the podcast. My name is Father Bill W. I'm an Episcopal priest, and I live here in Austin, Texas. I've had the gift of sobriety since December the 27th of 1972. Very grateful for that. And glad you guys have joined. You're coming to the end, or we are, to a series we're doing on a book called Spiritual Evolution. The author is George Vaillant. He was a research psychiatrist at Harvard University, and he was also a non-alcoholic trustee for Alcoholics Anonymous. And that kind of makes him sort of unique, that he's a scientist and really committed to scientific study and research and that kind of thing. But he was also very aware of what Alcoholics Anonymous was accomplishing through spirituality. So he's really been able to kind of travel between those two worlds, and I think bring out the best of both. So we're kind of getting to the end of his book. It's called Spiritual Evolution, and his belief is that spirituality is really the end goal of the recovery process, the 12-step process. But it needs to be better understood. What is spirituality? Kind of vague. It's amorphous. He gives a real clear definition. He says it is an amalgam, a coming together, a gathering of positive emotions, the experience of positive emotions. In the first 3 chapters, he locates this spirituality in the brain, centers in the brain that have evolved over millennium to accommodate these emotions in human beings. What are the emotions? And we've gone over these over the last several episodes: faith, hope, love, joy, forgiveness, compassion. And now in this episode, he's going to explore awe, AWE, and mystical illumination. Anyone who's reading Vaillant's book may find a chapter that really speaks to them. Might be the one on hope, might be the one on faith. This is the one that really spoke the loudest to me. It's really the culmination, I think, of the 12-step journey. It's where we're heading, and I worry that we're losing sight of that. It's not just meetings. It's the 12th step, having had originally a spiritual experience as a result of these steps. Later changed it to an awakening, but that's where it's at, and so that's the focus of this episode. The spiritual awakening, the sense of awe, AWE, that comes with that, comes over us with that. That's what he's going to kind of get into in this chapter. So he starts off saying that awe and the sense of the sacred are often dismissed as superstition by humanists, like people like Richard Dawkins, and they're seen as infantile regressions by psychiatrists like Sigmund Freud. Freud was not a believer in the power of spirituality, even in the existence of spirituality. Thank God, when Roland Hazard was searching for a psychiatrist, he tried to get a hold of Freud, and if he had, I think we'd be in bad shape today. So he wound up with Jung, and Jung had a very different notion of the power of the spiritual and how important it is and what can happen when we connect to that in the deepest parts of our lives. So Vaillant concludes something different from these guys. He says that the experience of mystical illumination, or the sacred, call it what you will, is hardwired in the human brain. Awe can be suppressed, ignored, and even desecrated, but never destroyed. There's something about human beings when we're really at the high point of our consciousness, that connects us to something beyond ourselves. And the response to that is awe. You know, sometimes you're driving early in the morning and the sun comes out, or you're flying on a plane and you're up in the clouds and you see a sunrise and you're transported. You're experiencing awe in the deepest sense of that word, or at the birth of a child. There's something magical, wonderful that you're encountering, or a rock formation, a mountain. Your ego is finally right sized and it's, oh my God. Well, that's the word God whether we're using there, because that's what comes into play. So he says this, there's many paths to this experience, but it's happening within the limbic system of the human brain. What are the paths? He said the heart and the brain, science and spirituality, the limbic and the neocortical are all, of course, inextricably linked. Similarly, with the exception of their differing religious beliefs, the great spiritual exemplars, teachers of throughout history, have shared much in common in terms of their outward behavior. So he lists some people: Albert Schweitzer, the Lutheran; Mother Teresa, the Catholic; Viktor Frankl, the Jew; Martin Luther King Jr., the Baptist; Mahatma Gandhi, the Hindu; the Dalai Lama, the Buddhist; Leo Tolstoy, the Russian Orthodox. All of them have left lasting spiritual impressions upon billions. And he says these men and women modeled the triumph of positive over negative emotions, that they went within themselves to a place where they could realize these positive emotions: faith, joy, awe, forgiveness, compassion, and that these things have huge ramifications. Says, none of them was a theologian. They may have differed enormously in their core beliefs and the amount of time each spent in prayer and meditation. Nevertheless, they were all brilliant, all used their highly evolved neocortices, the frontal lobes, to focus, channel, and transmute their limbic passion for the betterment of others. They have an experience. They have an inward experience that is really not subject to verbalization, but they're able, through their lives, through their activities, through living, to inspire others. She says the moral compass of their inner lives produced awe, AWE, again, in their admirers. Of note, however, is that none of them were just humanists. They all believed in a power greater than themselves. And that's what 12-step is all about. We've come upon a problem that we cannot solve by ourselves, and that by finding a connection to this inner source of power, of life, we're not terribly concerned what you call it, but we're very concerned that you connect with it. And that's the thing that is common to us in this thing called recovery. Awe then comes from an experience of this, an encounter with something that is beyond the ego. And that encounter allows us to enter into what the big book terms a fourth dimension of existence, where the divine, in effect, resides. God is not out there sitting on a cloud. God is inside of us, waiting to be realized and incarnated in our own lives. I've mentioned this before, but in his autobiography, we're all familiar with Bill Wilson and his white light experience in Towns Hospital. We've heard that one 100 times, but this wasn't his first encounter with the divine. It kind of, like many of us, it was coming to him over time. He was evolving, Vaillant would say, in his own life. He lists three of them, three prior experiences in his autobiography, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes. The first was when he was sitting on the beach with Lois. He's in Rhode Island, and he's looking out over the cliffs to the ocean, all right? And he's going off to war. I want to pause for this because I think that's really important. His little ego is threatened. He's scared. And then something happens deep inside of him that he's able to transcend the fear, to overcome the fear. How? By connecting to something greater than himself. So this is what he writes. The sun was just setting, and as the minutes passed, our gloom was superseded by a growing feeling of duty and patriotism. And we talked about those things. And then it turned into an exaltation, a joy that I now realize amounted to a genuine spiritual experience. In other words, we found exaltation in the joy of sacrifice. We were given the strength and the joy to go on in the face of utter perilousness over the circumstances. That was the first outline and trace of the spiritual experience mechanism as it evolved in me over the years. I never shall forget that experience. It was triumphant. So he's there with Lois. He's going off to war. He's scared to death. And something takes hold of him that is higher than he is. And they allow it to come. So you can almost sense the ego receding, and it's full of fear, filled with anxiety. Our egos thrive on that. But in the moment, it was transcended, and something else comes in to take its place. That's the beginning of the spiritual experience, he says, in his life. He transcended himself, his usual self, and came in contact, in living connection with a higher self, a greater self. That, guys, is what the spiritual journey is all about. How do we do that? Well, you can go off to war, and that will certainly help things, because you'll be scared to death. And what do they say? God is discovered in the foxholes. It's God help me. You're aware of your need for something beyond your normal self. His second came in a near-death experience, and Vaillant gets into this later in this chapter. But in a near-death experience, he was on board a ship and was taking him, was off the coast of Iceland. He was heading towards the war, and the ship had been hit, and the men on board were panicking. Wilson was in charge of this little section of the crew, and he found the courage within himself, the courage that he said was beyond himself. And he connected to that power within himself. And here he says, quote, another tremendous spiritual experience, this wave of complete confidence and exaltation. Again, a sense of perfect well-being. His third experience came in Winchester Cathedral. And this one does make it into the big book, where he saw an inscription on a tombstone, and he says, quote from the book, I remember standing there, and again the spiritual experience repeated itself. I was lifted up into a sort of ecstasy. I somehow had a mighty assurance that things were and would be all right. Some of what Wilson first wrote about that experience in the cathedral, it got edited out, unfortunately. It got edited out of the big book because it sounded perhaps too religious, and it might scare people off early in the book. So what he first wrote was this: we were in England. I stood in Winchester Cathedral with head bowed. in the presence of something I had never felt before. Where now was the God of the preachers? Across the channel, thousands were perishing that day. Why did he not come? Suddenly, in that moment of darkness, he was there. I felt an enveloping, comforting presence with a capital P. Tears stood in my eyes. I had glimpsed the great reality. There's something that connects tremendous fear with a turning to the power greater than self. It's when the self collapses. That's exactly what happened to me. I mean, I was in Cleveland, Ohio. That was where I hit my bottom. I was getting ready to run, and I didn't know where the hell to go. And it was then that I heard a voice in my head. The first time I ever heard that voice. And it said, you know, Bill, if those are your two choices, I was either going to Australia to stay drunk or go to India and try to get holy. Neither of them would have worked. Said the voice said, those were your two choices. There's something wrong with you. So what did I experience? I experienced ego collapse. I didn't know what the hell was happening to me. I couldn't use those words at that time. But this is what bottom is about. It's when we've run out of options, when the ego is up against the wall. That's a wonderful opportunity for change to come about, really deep, profound change, a turning to what? To whatever, to whomever. Do I know? Probably not. But can I turn? Yes, I can. Please help me. Please help me. Quotes a fellow scientist who gives a nice definition of spirituality. He says spirituality is derived from spirit, which is from the Latin breath. Spirituality, like breathing, is a participation in this animating energy, this life-giving energy that cycles through time and space to create and sustain all life. Through spiritual practice, we come to know ourselves in an interdependent relationship to the universe. We learn to live as radically responsive to the needs and desires of others as we come to see ourselves as integrally connected. Through this discipline of understanding our connectedness to all of life and the source of all life, we grow in humility, reverence, and openness. Inevitably, a deep and abiding gratitude awakens. So if you want to look at the, what happens in the course of 12-step recovery, that's it. We get in touch with spirit. We remove the obstacles to spirit in our life. Those are steps 4 through 9, and then we learn to live in relationship to this spirit. We integrate it in our lives, and we sense then our connectedness, not just to spirit, but to others, and particularly the others we are here to help. So it's a breaking down of the barriers, an opening to the spirit, and then being guided through our connection to the spirit to other people. And that's in particular where two-way prayer becomes so very important. Another thing, unfortunately, that got left out of the program. What happens as a result of this connectedness? So we transcend our smaller selves. We gain a new level of consciousness, a union with the greater self. And the result is what? It's this state of awe, of mystical union, an awareness, a new awareness of who we really are. And suddenly, we ain't who we thought we were. We're different. We're teachable now. We're humble and able to learn. Boy, you take someone who's come back from a spiritual experience, an encounter like this, and it's like they're a different person. just not the same man or woman. George references a test that a scientist had developed to measure this sense of union. Scientists are all about measuring things and repeating it so that it can be proved, in kind of the quote laboratory. So this is called Cloninger's scale of self-transcendence. So little questions that are, there's 4 or 5 questions stuck into a list of 30 or 40 questions, but these are the ones that are going to register, is some spiritual transformation happening? So listen to some of these questions. And then I want you to ask yourself, can you relate to these? And my guess is most of us really can. So here's question 1. I sometimes feel so connected to nature that everything seems to be part of one living organism. The barriers, the things that separate me from the world, they begin to subside. And a sense of connectedness, of joining, takes their place. Oneness, unity. Another question. Sometimes I have felt like I was part of something with no limits or boundaries in time and space. Boy, that happens to me when I catch one of those sunrises or sunsets. My lens changes, my view changes. I watch the Hubble telescope, I watch the pictures that come back, and suddenly my world is transformed. And what's the sense? It's awe, AWE. God, this is amazing. Where do I fit in? I do fit in. And I fit in through my conscious recognition and my participation of it. Third question, I often feel a strong spiritual or emotional connection with all the people around me. Haven't you felt that at a meeting? Haven't you felt that sometimes with your children, your spouse? The ego barriers that are there kind of give way, and something much deeper and richer is present. It's a shift in consciousness. Fourth one, I've had moments of great joy in which I suddenly had a clear, deep feeling of oneness with all that exists. Not separated. If there's one feeling that alcoholics and addicts report over and over again, it's I feel separated from. I'm separated from God. I'm separated from life. I'm separated from my true self. Yeah, that's the feeling. And what's the recovery? The recovery is reconnecting to each and every one of these things. And these questions aren't, you might notice, they're not very religious, but they're deeply, deeply spiritual. And my guess is that many of us have had these moments, these connections with a phrase I love, the beyond that is within. But we don't talk about them too much. Maybe we should. Maybe that would make spiritual experience more understandable and less strange as a phenomenon. It's a lot more common than we let on. The next point he makes, just as Bill did in step 12, is that the mystical experience, the encounter with the divine, then naturally leads outward. It leads to service. So in AA, we say love and service are our codes. Not just love and not just service, but it's the combination of the two, the love that leads to service. And sometimes it can go the opposite way, the service that leads to love. George writes, at the end of the day, service to the community usually trumps meditative bliss. In other words, the service is more important than the bliss ninnies of, navel gazing and feeling the divine connectedness. That's nice. It's not what's nearly as important as the connecting then to other people. He says our biological need to provide care to others cannot be ignored. Let me offer an analogy, he says. At times, raising children can feel like being subjected to slavery, whereas solitary meditation or fishing alone on a pristine mountain lake can bring utter bliss. Nevertheless, on their deathbeds, more people probably rejoice in having raised children than in having achieved precious moments of meditational nirvana. We profit from both an inner quest for the sacred and altruistic service to others, but the latter is more closely linked to survival. He keeps going back to his scientific thing. And what he's saying here, it's very important, is that we are, as a species, evolving towards being more loving, more compassionate, more honest. We have some terrible relapses. I think we're in the middle of one right now on the world scene. But over time, we are moving forward. That's his belief. So one's more important than the other. In the end, it's not the bliss, it's not the nirvana, it's the service to others, the altruism that comes as a result, oftentimes, of this breakthrough. Quote some saints and sages that I think can be instructive to us. First one he quotes from is John of the Cross, a great Spanish mystic from the Middle Ages or so. And he says this: God, deliver us from people who are so spiritual that they want to turn everything into perfect contemplation. It refers to Ignatius, St. Ignatius of Loyola, another mystic, founder of the Jesuits, whose motto became contemplatives in action. Yeah, you experience the divine, but if it's a genuine experience of the divine, it's going to lead you out into the world, just like our 12th step. Having had a spiritual awakening experience as a result of these steps, as a result of that, we tried to carry this message to others. See, it's outward. You go in, you have it, and then out you go. Gandhi led a life of prayer, but that prayer led him to action. And through it, he succeeded in defeating the whole British Empire in India. And he's quoted saying this: such power as I possess in the political field has derived from my experiences in the spiritual field. So the greater this connection in the spiritual realm, the greater will be, should be, can be my impact on the world. Finally, he quotes the Buddha in a short sentence of instructions to his disciples. He says this: go forth, O monks, and travel for the welfare and happiness of the multitude, out of compassion for the world, for the good, welfare, and happiness of gods and men. George concludes, spirituality is rarely just about solitary gurus on mountaintops. Not in the West, he says, not in the East, not anywhere. That's our spiritual heritage. Wilson says we're not teaching anything new in AA. It's the combined wisdom of the centuries. That if we can have this spiritual experience, if we can tap into the power that resides inside all of us, all right, and connect to it in a new and empowering way, that's going to be the solution to our addiction problem. He has a section in there on near-death experiences and the emergence of awe. As I said, this is really our first step experience that many of us have in the program. You can look at your first step as a near-death experience. Mine was. you know, and many of us are suicidal. This was very helpful to me. I finally got in therapy when I'm feeling suicidal. It's I want to kill myself. I guess that's the nature of suicide. Kill the self. But the therapist asks, which self? Isn't it the false self that's running my life? And I want to kill that. And that's actually a proper response to it. And when I was in treatment, a counselor asked me, "Hey, Bill, if somebody said to you the things you say to you about yourself, what would you do to that guy?" I said, "I'd kill him." "Good morning," was the response. "Good morning. Are you starting to see it? Are you starting to see your addiction as a form of suicide? Trying to kill myself, because I don't like that self." Well, there is another self. That's the whole thing. Big Book says, and I hate the religious terminology that goes with this, but we were born again. So you got to die to this old self so that what? So that the new self can come into existence. That's the journey. That's the journey. Sometimes I'll hear a therapist, a counselor, say to a patient, well, you got to go write your first step. I've got to present my first step in a group, as if the thing was logical and going to respond to logic. So I'm gonna bring all these instances of my powerlessness, my unmanageability, whatever the heck it might be. It may be helpful. I don't know. I'd much rather hear the patient say, or the counselor say to the patient, "Did you damn near die? And if you did, let's talk about that. Let's talk about what that felt like. Let's talk about how close you came to it. Let's talk about what you were feeling inside at those moments." Because now we're starting to get close. I've mentioned this a time or two before, but I will never forget. I'm a counselor. I'm sitting in a treatment center. I got 6 or 7 people in the group, and 2 guys are sitting right next to one another. One fellow is there because he wiped out a family in an automobile accident, killed 4 people. And his lawyer said it'd be a good idea for you to go to treatment. It'll look good on your record. And sitting next to him is a guy who checked himself into treatment because he'd grown up in an alcoholic family and he had sworn to God and anybody who'd listen that his drinking would never affect his children. And he got drunk and he missed his son's birthday and he became a puddle. And he was at his bottom. He had his guts wrung out of him. The other guy wasn't close to having it done. That's the first step. What is that feeling like? What does it feel like to be hopeless? That's step one in a word, is hopelessness. And then hopelessness brings us into the second step of hope. Came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. There's a turn, an internal turn towards what? I don't know, but it ain't me. And that's what's important. Another waste of time trying to define God and figure out your own conception of God. You don't know. Whoever you are, if you're there. That was the old Oxford group prayer. Oh God, if there is a God, help me, because I'm in touch with my need for help from outside of self. You start getting into that territory, you're starting to open yourself up to the spiritual dimension that recovery is all about. So we're talking about near-death experiences. Hey, George Wright says, whatever their explanation, secular or divine, near-death experiences are profoundly spiritual. For example, after open heart surgery, a 31-year-old woman explained, this is a quote from her, "But I wasn't afraid. I felt this feeling of love. It was like all of a sudden, I could feel this whole feeling of love and joy. It was all around me. I saw this circle of light off in the distance. I'll never forget it. And I could feel this love just coming from the light. It was a true love, a pure love, free of earthly worries, absolute pure love. And the response to that is a sense of awe. I'm in the presence of something beyond me, beyond my usual thought life, my usual mind. My mind has expanded. It's opened up to something beyond itself. Being the scientist, Vaillant quotes from a published scientific study of near-death experiences. It says they studied 344 consecutive patients who required cardiac resuscitation in the hospital. 18% had near-death experiences. Some others really came close. He said of the 62 patients who qualified, 56% experienced positive emotions, almost dead or right on the edge. Positive emotions at that moment. 23% felt communion, joining with a bright light. 31% experienced moving through a tunnel. 13% engaged in life reviews. I had a dream many years ago. It was a very important dream for me. I was running, crawling through this tunnel. Fine, crawl, crawl, crawl. And at the end, I come out, and there's a red-headed angel there who says, "Well, Bill, this time you made it." I don't know what the hell shifted inside me that night, but something shifted, and my unconscious mind was registering that, and I could feel it. I woke up with an altered state of consciousness. I can't say that it lasted terribly long. We'll get to that in a little while, but it was profound. It was profound. It was a shift. See, we're shifting our center from self to a power greater than self. And what goes along with that shift is an experience of awe, an experience of wonder, an experience of connectedness. It's just part and parcel of the journey. They followed up with that group 8 years later, and they remembered that experience. It was profound. It's like trauma, the trauma can stay with you for years and years and years. You think it's over, and there it is. It reemerges. Same thing with this thing. They remembered it like it was yesterday. My experience in Cleveland, where I hit my bottom, I can remember that like it was yesterday. I know where I was standing in the room when that voice spoke to me. Boy, because it was different than anything that had happened before. It was profound. William James talks about this, did a whole series on this. I'll put a link to the William James series in the show notes. A fellow named Paul S. did a really nice book on it. If you're interested, it's a well worth your time. But Vaillant highlights James's report in Varieties of Religious Experience, several characteristics of these mystical experience. He says they are: one, difficult to express in words, but provide evocative insights. I get it. I get it. It's like when step one becomes a reality for us. I get it. I got it. I can't put it into words, but I got it. It's experienced as new depths of truth. Gospel says, "I am the way, the truth, the life." The truth. There's a lot of manipulation and lying that the ego thrives upon. But in a mystical experience, you're in the presence of truth. Can't describe it, but I know it. I know it. And that's what Jung said when he was asked, did he believe in God? He had an experience of God in his life. Can't take that away. 3, involve a sense of being controlled by or belonging to a power outside of self. There's that connectedness thing. I don't know who this power is. but I now know that this power and I, my ego self, have business to do. One's in charge and one is not. Number four, rarely sustained beyond an hour or two. You can go to the mountaintop, but you can't stay at the mountaintop. You know, you got to come down to the valley, often accompanied by a sense of bright light. There's an illumination to this experience. So in step 12, again, we have the experience. It's the purpose of the steps, and that's important. We lead it out to other people, but the experience itself is important, and don't fly over that one. And you think of the 12th step, it's just helping other people. No, it's more than that. It's having had the experience, then helping other people, or helping other people and expanding on the experience. Keep those two in tandem with one another. Just a few other points that Vaillant covers in this chapter. We don't have time to really go into them all, but each of them, kind of could evolve into a series of its own, because they're important elements. So I might do that. First is the benefit of meditation. He points that out. This is a legitimate path to attaining an altered state of consciousness. Why? Because it's a quieting of the ego mind and finding another mind residing within us. So through prayer and meditation. So letting go, resting, soaking in this presence that is approachable, experienceable through this practice. And he talks about psychedelics and the effects of these, because it's the same part of the brain that is being affected by these drugs. And there is a renewed interest in the benefits of certain psychoactive drugs that might help produce a spiritual experience that's going to be helpful to people. Now, I don't know enough about this to comment. There are some really important studies out there, kind of a little dangerous to mention. I mean, I had my time with LSD and such, but so did Bill Wilson. Although, I was using it to kind of get high, not a very inspirational motivation on my part, but that's where I was back in those days, before sobriety. But Wilson took it after he got sober. He participated with some doctors in some studies. Because why? Because he was really convinced that if alcoholics could undergo a spiritual experience such as he experienced in town hospital and in the other things that we talked about in this episode, that if they could just get a handle on that, a connection to that, then their recovery would just be a matter of time, because they would have found something legitimate that takes them to that place of safety, security, assurance, light out of the darkness, all of that stuff that the mystics found, and that I think alcoholics and addicts are often misplaced mystics. We're looking for that connection, but we're looking for it illegitimately. We're looking for it in the wrong places. It's interesting, the studies that I have read about the use of LSD and some of those kinds of drugs, they always sacramentalize them. It's not like, well, here's the pill, or here's the acid. They will ritualize it so that there's an encounter with the sacred that is coming, because that's where it's at. It's getting into right relationship with the divine. That's the recovery that God could do for us what we cannot do for ourselves. Well, you got to establish a connection. You got to have a belief in that. Have an experience of that is going to help you have the belief in it. It'll go beyond belief. It'll be knowledge. The other thing Wilson was kind of obsessed with was vitamin therapy, vitamin B3, niacin, taking that. He thought that might be the thing that's gonna help alcoholics. He actually believed that when he was doing those studies and such, that he'd be more remembered for that work than he would for his work with Alcoholics Anonymous. Unfortunately, religion has turned into, by and large, a belief system. I got to believe this, I got to believe that. And it's the furthest thing from what's going to change you. What's going to change you is an experience, a dynamic encounter with the divine, you know? And so fasting, pilgrimages, music, encounters like that are much more likely to bring about an effect of what? Of lowering the ego's guard so that the divine can enter in and transform. All right. I mean, that's the journey. That's the journey. So Bill went to the edge. Dr. Bob went to the edge as well. These guys were kind of mystics in the making, practicing spiritualism that doesn't get talked about much in the book, but they were definitely doing it. They had the spook room in where Bill lived, and they would use Ouija boards and stuff like that. Kind of frowned on, I guess, today in proper AA, but they were on the edge. They were on the edge. I mean, I went with Richard Rohr out to New Mexico, spent 5 days doing sweat lodges and things of that nature, and vision quests and drumming. Powerful, powerful, evocative encounters with the deeper parts of self that, woo, I'll never forget those. You know, I'll forget every lecture I've ever been to. Because why? Because it's head knowledge. This is heart knowledge. This is experiential. Those are the kind of treatment options that I think really impact clients today. It's not just sitting there with their little notebooks taking down what the wise man or woman is spouting. It's being reached and going to the depths. That's where it happens. He quotes pretty extensively from William Miller's book on quantum change. I interviewed Miller. He's a professor, was at the University of New Mexico. Really good book. I'll put a link to that in the thing. Did a whole series on it. So if you're interested, you can go and look that up there. So, you know, there are a number of psychologists and I think a number of religious innovators who are really starting to put the spiritual and the psychological together, and they're doing it in new and exciting ways. And I really believe AA blazed some trails in this regard. And when they studied AA in the beginning, it was a heck of a lot more than just going to meetings. It was deep prayer, deep meditation, rigorous honesty, absolute honesty, to be more technically correct. And the result is awe. The result is, you know, what they told me in treatment was, Bill, you better find something that feels better than alcohol or drugs, or you're going back to them. Well, awe feels better. And my experience is two-way prayer is a huge part of opening the door to that encounter with the divine. It's not just mechanically saying prayers. It's being in the presence of the divine and listening to the divine as it speaks through my heart, all right? Not through my head. And what comes through? Love, joining, unity. It's the stuff I've been looking for. It's the stuff we've all been looking for, but I'm looking for it in the wrong places. Okay, enough out of me. We got one more chapter. It's the longest I've ever gone on any one book, but I just found it tremendously helpful, and I hope some of you guys and gals have as well. Some real insights to be gained there. It's got one more chapter, and it's really devoted to the spirituality of AA, and he's got some good stuff in there. I think it's worth visiting, and so we will do that next time. And if it has been helpful, I hope you'll pass this on to other people. Let them know that these podcasts are available, and then just keep coming back. Love you. Take care. God bless.